was inspired to create sustainable shoes after his daughter found plastic all over what had been a pristine beach in Hawaii. He crowdsourced the money, and yesterday in the United States his company, Vaccination, launched its first range of 4 styles of shoes made of merino, discarded pineapple husks, algae, bamboo and recycled plastic. We met Jeremy at the start of the journey, so we'll catch up again now. And after 10. It feels so much longer than just 2 years ago, the black summer bushfires that swept across Australia. Remember the orange skies we were having in New Zealand? It was particularly catastrophic in Australia's southeast. Our guest is the documentary filmmaker Eva Orner, who's made award-winning films on a number of topics, but has focused on the stories of bushfire victims and the link still denied by some Australian politicians and media outlets back to climate change. You are listening to 9 to Noon on RNZ National. Well, first, warnings the economy will suffer unless changes are made to the way maths are taught or is taught. Maths scores have been declining for the past 20 years relative to other OECD countries. Earlier this year, in July, an Education Review Office report warned of slipping standards in the teaching of maths, with teacher capability a particular concern. Now a report from the think tank, the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research, argues that students could learn better from specialist or expert maths teachers. It also backs more traditional settings rather than digital learning environments. There are also wider systemic issues affecting the learning of maths. Changing schools too often, for instance, due to housing issues, is linked to lower achievement at school. NZIER says students missing out on a maths education have fewer opportunities for jobs with good earning potential, and that New Zealand's economy needs good maths performers to improve tech capability in the workforce. To discuss, we welcome senior economist at the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research, Olivia Willis, and also Associate Professor of Mathematics at the University of Canterbury, who was on the recent Royal Society Expert Advisory Panel on refreshing the maths curriculum, Dr. Rua Murray. Tēnā koe ko Rua, welcome both.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Wonderful to have you here. Now, Olivia, can you explain what your report is based on? It draws on other research, yes?
Yeah, so we use 2 international surveys, the Programme for International Student Assessment, PISA, and the Trends in International Maths and Science Study, TIMSS. So these are 2 international surveys which track maths performance, and they're longitudinal, so they've been running for a long time. And in those we can see these declining maths scores.
Plenty have drawn attention to this, as we mentioned ERO, the Royal Society as well, but can you just remind people of what the trajectory has been of New Zealand students' results compared to the average in the OECD?
Yeah, so what we're seeing in the PISA is we used to be quite high above the OECD, and now we're declining to be just above the OECD average. The TIMSS tells a slightly different story, where we're now one of the lowest performing countries. And for us in New Zealand, we're seeing that that's happening across the board. So for both the high achieving and the low achieving performers, they're all declining.
Can it be explained by some countries in these OECD surveys improving their performance relative to earlier years? Or is there an indication of absolute decline in how New Zealand students are going?
So really we're seeing an absolute decline, while the OECD is seeing a general trajectory upwards, yeah.
Having looked at these international test results, you've gone on to draw conclusions about teaching and learning practice. What are they?
Well, of course, there's so many moving parts when it comes to education that it's really hard to isolate exactly what it is that's going to improve maths performance, but we can draw out some things. So we can see that for Year 5 students, in New Zealand, 15% are taught by teachers with specialist maths training, but the international average is actually 43%. And then if we look at the Year 9 teachers, the biggest factor that they're likely to say is limiting their teaching capacity is the lack of prerequisite knowledge or skills for students. So, I mean, we can take these to suggest that there could be an argument for increased maths specialisation, better support for teachers in those earlier years.
We're going to talk in much more detail about this also with our guest, with Dr. Murray. But do you pinpoint changes in the way maths is taught in New Zealand, and particularly where it sits in the primary curriculum, as a factor in this?
I mean, at this stage, we know that there's things that we can rule out as being the reason, but not necessarily what we can directly attribute it to. So we know that overall level of spending isn't the thing to blame because we sit just above the OECD average in terms of overall spending per student. And that's been steadily increasing while our maths scores have been declining. So it's much more about where that money's going rather than the absolute value of it. But certainly, when we look at those statistics on the level of maths specialist training in those primary school knowledge, and we know that that's intuitively, it makes a lot of sense. We might remember our own primary school or secondary school really passionate maths teachers or particular teachers that stay with you. They can be really inspiring, and that's the kind of drive you need to get you through those years.
The confidence of teaching of maths and the confidence of those who are teaching it has been raised as a factor by others. We've certainly discussed it with the people who teach the teachers, and it may well also have been raised in the context of Aero looking into this. Again, is it something you've explored?
Yes, we've taken a look at the level of teacher confidence, and we can see that at the primary school level and the secondary school level, teachers are saying maybe don't feel quite as prepared in particular areas of the curriculum. So we know that teachers have huge amounts of pressures from many directions, and we're really advocating for more support for these teachers.
Another conclusion you've reached, again from results, is the setting for the learning of maths. And you've come out for a more traditional setting as opposed to digital. We know obviously a pandemic means a lot of digital is happening at the moment, but if we think about normal times, what are you talking about there?
Yeah, this is a really interesting thing which has come out of the surveys, where New Zealand's actually got the highest level of digital technology use in the maths classroom of all the countries surveyed. But of course, we've got those quite low maths scores. So we can see that that's not translating into good outcomes. And we know that there's reports from Silicon Valley, for example, where parents are going off to drive technological change, probably very competent mathematicians themselves, but increasingly sending their children to completely digital-free schools because I think that's got more kind of creative, critical thinking learning objectives. So, I mean, we're not saying that we need to take digital out of the classroom at all, just that we may need to rethink how it's being used and make sure that we're targeting it effectively.
Your wider argument in this report is that it's not just about individual children missing out, that there will be wider impacts. How so?
Yes, so because we see those declines both at the bottom and at the top of the distribution, so we've got fewer students who are hitting the low benchmark, and this is a problem because they miss out on the benefits day to day, things like managing finances and having financial literacy, interpreting the news, and also missing out on those more lucrative jobs and career options, which maths is a gateway for. But then we've also got fewer students who are hitting the high benchmark. And this is important because maths is really important for innovation, and innovation makes a more productive economy. And when I talk about productivity, I mean, we will need less inputs to get the same amount of outputs. So an innovative economy, more productive, it means that we
need the workers with the skills, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. We can have that more sustainable growth. So it means less work hours and taking less things out of the ground to get the same outcomes.
Yeah. Ironically, sometimes it often does involve technological innovation, but the argument you're making is the tech sector needs the people with the skills to produce the technological innovations. Also, you argue that economic and social inequality is a factor in who does well in maths. Again, this has been established in other research, but you argue that maths capability is also a factor in increasing inequality itself. Does this come back to earning potential and job opportunities?
Yeah, so those effects really compound over time. And maths is really that it's a gateway into so many different opportunities. And once you're in, there's just more opportunities that open in front of you. So these really multiply and they can have quite significant lifetime and intergenerational effects.
Stay with us, Olivia. Thank you. Olivia Willis is a researcher, a senior economist at the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research, or NZIER, nearly 17 minutes past 9. As I introduced, Dr. Rua Murray is Associate Maths Professor at the University of Canterbury and was on the recent Royal Society Expert Advisory Panel on refreshing the maths curriculum. Kia ora again.
Kia ora koutou katoa and good morning. With vaccination rates moving to and beyond 90% across the country, New Zealand is close to transitioning to the traffic light system and a much greater sense of normality. As we move into the new framework, many people have been seeking greater certainty about workplace vaccination requirements. That's why a few weeks ago I announced that we would introduce a clearer and simplified risk assessment process for employers to follow when deciding whether they can require vaccination for different kinds of work. Today I'm setting out this simple and clear vaccination assessment tool and how it will work. The tool provides a clear legal framework to help businesses and other organisations who employ people make decisions about vaccinations in the workplace. Employers who use it correctly will have a very high degree of legal certainty about their decisions. It builds on the guidance provided by WorkSafe, has had input from Business New Zealand and the Council of Trade Unions, and is based on public health advice. The tool will specify 4 factors, at least 3 of which must be met, before it would be reasonable to require vaccination for particular work. These factors are, firstly, how large is the space that people work in? How close people are to others? How long they are near others? And finally, whether they provide services to people who are vulnerable to COVID-19. This will enable businesses and organisations to do much more easily what many of them are already getting on with. For example, Air New Zealand and the Warehouse, who are currently working through risk assessment processes to determine workplace vaccination requirements. This is also becoming fairly common in countries overseas, for example, the Commonwealth Bank, Qantas, Westpac and News Corp in Australia. I want to be very clear that this new process won't override risk assessments that businesses have already done under existing health and safety guidelines. Businesses can also continue to undertake broader health and safety risk assessments if that works better for them. All health and safety risk assessments will remain valid. Legislation allowing the vaccination assessment tool to be created, as well as introducing a 4 weeks minimum paid notice period of termination and paid time off to get vaccinated, will be passed under urgency in the House this week. The assessment tool will then become available for business to use once regulations are made in mid-December under the amended law. We've also decided to mandate vaccination for workers at businesses where My Vaccination passes may operate or operate with fewer restrictions at all levels of the COVID-19 protection framework. We've tested this with stakeholders and it's received broad support, including from religious communities. As a reminder, this mandate, the CVC mandate, applies to hospitality, events, gatherings, close contact businesses and gyms, places where the risk of transmission is higher. To continue doing work in these areas, workers will need to have their first vaccination by the day that the COVID-19 protection framework comes into effect, which is Friday, the 3rd of December. These workers will need to be fully vaccinated by the 17th of January 2022 to continue doing their work. This is to make sure that those workplaces are as safe as possible and to give confidence to both staff and customers. Already, the vast majority, over 91% of the eligible population are vaccinated, with thousands more getting vaccinated every day. So we're well placed to move into the COVID protection framework. Today's announcements will further strengthen our safeguards. For those who are not yet vaccinated, especially workers in areas where My Vaccine passes may be used to operate, please get your first dose as soon as possible. Thank you very much and happy to take your questions.
What will the penalty be for businesses that don't enforce vaccine passes?
There are a range of penalties that are currently in the law and they will be increased in legal changes that we are bringing in shortly. The fines will increase to levels of $12,000 for a company or to $15,000 for a court-imposed fine for a company.
And when will they have to legally be checking those by? Like, is there any kind of grace period which gives them some time to figure it out?
No, when the new COVID protection framework comes into effect from the 3rd of December, it will be a requirement for My Vaccine Passes to be shown for those businesses who opt into it, and it will be a requirement for all workers in those workplaces to comply and to be vaccinated by that date, to have their first dose by that date.
Why is the assessment tool for businesses only becoming available in mid-December? Surely it's reasonable for businesses to want to have access to that before the traffic light system's implemented.
It's important to note that all businesses that they carry out are higher risk. So we want to make sure that we have the maximum possible level of protection for the staff who are working in those environments.
You said before that businesses that use the assessment tool correctly will have the legal backing and it'll be legally sound. But what happens to businesses that don't, and what checks are in place to ensure that people are using that tool properly?
Yeah. Under the changes that we will be introducing, businesses will be legally protected from the decision to utilise the tool. But they will still have to apply it in a way that's fair and reasonable and is consistent with their good faith obligations to the employees. So that'll mean things like communicating clearly and openly with the employees who might be affected, receiving their feedback and making decisions in a reasonable way. Cabinet's made the very clear decision that we would not take away. So that is a relatively significant portion of our workforce who will be covered by these vaccination requirements. I do note that internationally we now do have some countries who are pushing that out further. Austria with the all-of-population mandate, Northern Territory who require all work to be vaccinated. So we're trying to strike the right balance here, and we think that we've achieved that.
Still considering extending mandates to police and construction workers?
When Cabinet made its last set of decisions at the end of October, we set up two pieces of work. One was this piece of work, which was around establishing a clear and simple vaccination tool with strong legal backing. The other was to consider whether there should be additional vaccination mandates, including in those areas that you've mentioned, and we'll have further announcements to make on that part of it in the coming days.
And on the 40% number, do you have any sort of indication of how many people may choose not to be vaccinated and therefore lose their job?
We can draw some conclusions from areas where there have already been requirements that are put in place. So, for example, with the health and education orders that were put in place recently, at the first point, we've reached levels of around about 99% across both health and education in terms of workers who have been vaccinated. When we had the requirement applying to border workforces and at the air border and the maritime, we are engaging in consultation and engagement. So the tool's been developed by working with our social partners, with the CTU and Business New Zealand and other stakeholders, getting public health advice. We obviously can't move into establishing a piece of secondary legislation until after the primary legislation has passed, but we're talking about a couple of weeks at this point.
Right. Are you scrambling here?
No.
And in terms of for unvaccinated people who want to engage with businesses over summer, right? Is it fair to say that basically, if it's an indoor business where there's contact less than a metre apart, and you're likely to be there for more than be a customer of that business?
So the tool that we're talking about introducing, businesses who are covered by the CVC requirements, the first dose for vaccination will be required by the 3rd of December when the framework kicks in. The second will then be required by the 17th. And obviously that's because we need to have a decent period of time between the first dose and second dose requirements.
Your circumstance, though, is it to be opening up with these requirements and there hasn't been enough time to require workers to get fully vaccinated?
I disagree with that assertion. We already have 91% conversations over the past week with the Chief Executive of Waka Kotahi about work that can be done on a sector basis in horizontal construction to begin working through frameworks and making decisions there. And I think that's something that can be picked up alongside the mandates.
You said at the start there that there was going to be decisions on vaccine mandates or news on vaccine mandates in the coming day. Should we expect news on the police force or whatever today or tomorrow?
As I say, we will have further announcements on where we've gotten to in decision around mandates more broadly. I won't speculate about which.
Under this new risk assessment process, outside of people covered by the mandate, what kind of businesses and sectors do you anticipate that will go through this process and then end up having vaccines in place for their workers?
Look, while it will be up to individual employers and sectors to determine that, I'm hearing wide interest from businesses. So when I've been engaging with organisations like Business New Zealand, Retail New Zealand, other sector groups, all of them have been requesting that there is a simplified framework that is in place. So it would be my expectation that we have quite a high level of interest and uptake in the use of the vaccination tool. But as I say, there are also quite a number who in recent times have confirmed that Warehouse Group, for example, a very large employer, up that there's legal clarity about how the system will operate before that date. And you're right, we have a recess week next week, so that's why we do need to move forward with it this week. Look, I think it's fair to say that aspects of the COVID protection framework have been in the public domain for quite some time, are subject to pretty wide and open public debate, and also that we've been doing a lot of engagement with key stakeholders around these issues. So I've got a level of confidence that this is the appropriate way of giving certainty to people.
Is it also fair to say that in a more ideal world, legislation would go through the full process?
Look, we haven't lived in an ideal world over the last 2 years under COVID-19 is the truth. And we do sometimes, as a government, need to get on and put the structures and systems in place that keep people safe and give certainty. Within that, we will always try to have as much engagement as we possibly can, but we do also need to move forward and put these things in place. And look, I've spent most of the last 14 weeks in Auckland. People do want to see that we can clearly move forward. We've now,
Or could it be longer?
Look, I'd be loath to put a specific date on it, and I know that that's what people would love to hear, but the nature of the COVID-19 global pandemic is that every politician who's ever stood at a podium and said this is how it will be in 3 months' time or 6 months' time or a year's time has been proven to be wrong. We need to make sure that we have a framework in